Good morning. Welcome to Brown Bag Lunch, such as it is. You know, it's hard to imagine how so many things can happen in such a short time to one person. Okay, what they are, so forgive me. Okay, so this is too close, right? Is that better? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have one card going around today. Happy birthday for Karen Ganser. We wish her a very happy birthday, and we're going to try to make this happen. I don't have really any announcements today that I can think of. Just remember that the annual meeting is the 10th of July, which is a Thursday. We're going to have a wonderful program given by Nancy Johnson. It's going to be about Ansel Briggs, the first governor of Iowa, and you're going to learn some fantastic things about him, things that I'm sure you've never probably heard before, right?
I hope so.
Anyway, it's going to be a nice evening. It'll be at 7 o'clock, Thursday, July 10th, at the main museum. Everybody is welcome. There'll be wonderful desserts, but they won't be nearly as wonderful as Nancy's program. So please come in. So please join us for that.
A little deep in here.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about, as you can see, revisiting the Bellevue Cascade. Nancy's going to try to advance the slides for me, and this is going to be iffy. Okay, so we're talking about this today, so I want to take you back to 2014. So try to remember back when the Jackson County Historical Society theme for the year was All Aboard the Railroads of Jackson County. So that whole year we talked about Jackson County. So Nancy?
Just say next slide will be good.
That's not it. There, thank you. Okay, I will. Okay, so at that time, we had our Heritage Dinner in November, as we always do, and we had a wonderful program at the fairgrounds. And I hope that you attended that, and maybe this will help you remember. Our guest was Denny Rader, and he was on the Iowa Speakers Bureau tour. And as you know, some of our best programs and speakers have come from that group. Denny was from Windsor Heights, Iowa, and the program that he gave was entitled Grass Between the Rails, and he talked about Iowa Railroad history. And it was interesting to me, and I didn't realize at the time, I think, but it was an official Iowa Sesquicentennial event for 1996. That's why he wrote this program for them. And the program, when he gave his program to us on the fairgrounds and our museum on the fairgrounds, it was the 92nd time that he had given this program. And he had, and before he quit, he had done it 108 times. And 2 of those times were in Jackson County, because later the people at the Interpretive Center also had him appear there, so maybe you saw him there. He was a warm and wonderful and funny guy. He grew up on a farm overlooking the Chicago Great Western Main Line. He had been a songwriter and a musician all his life, and he combined that ability with his love of Iowa history to celebrate Iowa's railroad heritage in words and original music. But he especially loved our little Bellevue Cascade Railroad. And when he came to do his programs, he came dressed as a conductor, and he had his guitar and his banjo. Next slide, we hope. So, when we talk about the narrow gauge railroad, these are the only 2 sources that we have, or the only 2 resources that we have. The first is this book, which is what railroad people kind of call the Bible of the narrow gauge. It was written long ago by John Tigas and John Jacobson, and that's kind of all there was for a long time. Then they took the original pictures from this book, and they put it in this little book, which a lot of you have seen. So this is called Images of Rail, Iowa's Last Narrow Gauge Railroad. Much less expensive, but it's kind of a history of the narrow gauge in pictures, and very good pictures, and it's really a fun little book. But that's all we've ever had. When Denny was here, I was able to get to talk to him quite a bit as we arranged for his appearance and that sort of thing. So I spent time with him, and I was aware that he had written several books, and he had self-published 4 of these through what he called his Waukon and Mississippi Press. And he told me that for a long time he had worked on a book about the Slim Princess or the Milwaukee Narrow Gauge, but then this book came out just before he was ready to publish his, so he decided, and he never published it. So all of this research was just put away for a very long time. Denny passed away a few years ago. I was aware of that, and so I suppose that probably all that information just, you know, was lost along with him until a couple weeks ago, a really interesting package came in the mail. And in that, there were two copies of this book. Okay, next one.
I have a question.
Okay.
Why is it the narrow gauge railroad because the tracks are closer together? Okay.
It is the narrow gauge railroad because the tracks are closer together.
That's what I was assumed.
Okay. So, all of a sudden, 2 copies of his book appeared to us with a note to the museum director. And it was from his daughter, whose name was Kathy Bowermaster. And she said in her note that the year before Denny had died, he decided that he wanted to share the material that he had gathered all those years. And so he finished the book, and in 2018, he self-published just a very few books for himself, his family, and just a couple friends. And she had a couple books, she sent a couple books thinking that we would like to have them. Well, it was a wonderful compilation, and it is a compilation. Treasure trove of interviews that he had conducted from the 1970s, when people who were familiar with the narrow gauge, people who knew Lester Deppy, the last conductor, when all of those people were still around, he was able to talk to them and get first-hand interviews. So this little book that all of a sudden was here had lots of information, stories about the gauge, as they called it, and a lot of pictures that I had never seen before, because Denny was also, besides being a musician and a writer, he was also a photographer. And so he took a lot of his own pictures. Well, that was very important to us because some of the pictures we weren't sure whether we could use or not. So I was really excited, and I contacted his daughter Kathy and told her how exciting this news was to us. And she said, well, okay, she had 10 books left. That's all the books that were left. But then she wanted to come and visit, and she would bring us the 10 books. So I asked if maybe she could also give us permission to use the writings in this book and some of the pictures. And she said yes, that they owned the copyright and she could do that, and she would bring that when she came. Well, Saturday was the big day. Last Saturday, hot, as you know, very hot out in that depot and in that train car. But I just want to thank Bill Schwenker, and most of you know Bill on our board. He came for 2 days. He worked several hours sprucing up the depot and the train car because he knew they were coming. And it wasn't an easy job, because every now and then when we open the door, a bird sneaks into the depot. So this poor little bird had been in there for quite a while and made quite a mess. So it took him a long time. Well, in spite of the heat on Saturday, Denny's 2 daughters, Kathy and Jenny, arrived. Next photo. And they saw, they were just delighted to see the depot. They had known about it. They had known it was here, as it says in the book that it was moved here. But they were just so excited to find somebody, us, who cared about his work and how, you know, that was so special to them. And so I had planned out all the things I was going to do. I was going to really beg. I was going to beg for them to make more copies of the book that we could sell. They could make a little money, we could make little money, whatever. But you know, they were so impressed with what they saw that I didn't even have to beg. They just offered. They gave us 10 books. They gave us the letter giving us the rights to use every picture and everything in the book, which is a really neat thing. And they gave us a digital copy of the book with their permission to reprint it ourselves and keep all of the money for the Jackson County Historical Society. And we have our first purchaser right here. So the few people that have seen the book, everybody wants one. Because it's just a new source of information, and it's pretty exciting. I think we have one more picture of the daughters inside the depot, maybe. There they are, inside our little depot. And then the next picture. Okay, so as he talks a little bit in the beginning of the book how he researched for the book. He had heard that the city of Lamont was having their centennial celebration in 1979. Well, as he had been researching for the other books about railroads that he published, he was always coming across people who at some point had worked at this little railroad. And so he had filed away over the years bits and pieces of information for them. And then, like I said, he was in the late 70s, he was ready to publish his book when the other book came out. But he heard that Lamont was having their centennial celebration, so he got in touch with Rick Clausen, who then owned the depot, and Rick was restoring the depot at that time, so it would be all awesome, and it was kind of the highlight of the Lamont Centennial. And for those of you who knew Rick Clausen or knew about him, he did wonderful things to restore the depot, but he also designed he was quite the artist, and he also designed these things to sell to make money for the celebration that they were having. And he and Denny became good friends, and he ended up commissioning Denny to do the cover for his book. So he was invited to attend the celebration, next picture, and so he brought his van. And there he is, well, there he isn't, but there's his van. He parked it right by the depot, and he used this opportunity to interview all the people that came to see the depot. Lots of people came to see the depot because it hadn't been available to anybody for a lot of years. And he said that he set up, as you see the panels to the left, he had his railroad map so he could pinpoint where things happened, historical photos, and the cover of the 3 books he had already published. And on the right, he had some of the things that he was already collecting about the Bellevue and Cascade Railroad. And so on the table in front, you see his notebook and his cassette recorder so that he could take everybody's story down as people came to talk to him. And in his van, he had the ability to copy some of the original photos that people brought in. So that's how he started with his research. And I just wanted to show you next. This is Dennis Foy. And I just had to put this in here because Dennis Foy also had his van. Do you remember it ever? He would have it outside, he'd have it at the fair, and he'd have it everywhere, and he'd be sitting out there with his microphone, and he'd be talking to anybody who would talk to him and getting their stories as well. So I just thought that was kind of neat. Okay, so the next one. So an important person in this story is a man, and in the narrow gauge story, is a man by the name of Alvin Lee. He was kind of the narrow gauge expert, and he was one of the people that Denny was most grateful for. And he gave Denny all of his research and all of his drawings, which you see here, that were related to our narrow gauge, to use as he pleased, priceless information. And now all that information is in this book that we can use as we please. So, that was a good day for us. It was the drawings of Alvin Lee that helped us understand how the Lamont Depot was laid out, why we have 2 sets of tracks in front like we did, and that sort of thing. We got those from his pen and ink drawings of how things were in Lamont back in the day. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have known by now. It was also Alvin Lee's kind of blueprint that our railroad guys used to construct our combine number 8. They didn't have any blueprints or anything like that. They looked at his drawings of combines, his measurements, and that's how they built the train car that's sitting out here. So we owe Alvin Lee a great debt. And it's wonderful that we can now safely use all his information. We can also use all the photos that are in that, and that's a great thing. So Alvin Lee wrote, just for a little history and kind of to answer Nancy's question, Al Lee wrote that there were 12 narrow gauge railroads in Iowa through time. I know that the State Historical Society says 15, but he lists 12. And he said that today, we today, wonder why anybody would ever build a narrow gauge railroad. But he said if you look back to 1875, the answer is really clear. Automobiles were unknown in 1875. Roads were wretched, even for a horse and wagon to get over. No one could get anywhere most of the year. They were either frozen ruts that they couldn't get through, or they were a sea of mud that they couldn't get through. And so the horse and the train were the mainstays of travel. That's kind of all you had. And he said farmers and small town folk, like people around here, needed a way to move, and they needed a way to move their products, to get them to market and that sort of thing. So there was a great need, but money was scarce. And less expensive railroad had to be built. Narrow gauge engines and cars were lighter, and so they cost less. The roadbed might meander a little bit, but heavy excavating work could be held to a minimum. And I know that you've heard stories about how the people that lived along the narrow gauge were so excited that this train was coming to help them out, that they even used their draft horses and their equipment to help prepare the way, to help prepare the roadbed so the track could be laid. You certainly wouldn't see anything like that happening today. So next photo. Another drawback was, as you see here, it would take 4 narrow gauge box cars, the little one, to be offloaded into one big standard gauge car, 4 to 1. But in 1875, speed wasn't that important. And people who had to change trains to get from one place to another, that was routine. And even the transfer of freight like this to a standard gauge was not too great an objection. So the consensus was, why not build a narrow gauge railroad? And that's why there were 12 or maybe 15 in Iowa. According to Alvin Lee, and he wrote many articles for railroad magazines and things like that, one of the very finest of the narrow gauges ran from Bellevue on the Mississippi River to Cascade, Arlo Railroad, 36 miles to the west. It was built in 1879 as the Chicago, Bellevue, Cascade, and Western. But before the year 1880 ran out, it was known as the Chicago, Clinton, Dubuque, and Minnesota. And soon thereafter, it became known as the Bellevue and Cascade branch of the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul. And so most of our little railroad's life, it was part of the big Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. It was built with roller coaster grades and curves galore because it went through really rough territory up there. There were all kinds of hills and vales and that sort of thing. The rails that were used on this railroad were 56 to 60 pound rails. So if it's a 60 pound rail, that meant that a 3-foot section would weigh 60 pounds, 3 foot of rail. When we got the rail to put in front of our depot out here, I believe it was 70 pounds. That was the smallest that we could get. And even after we got our grant from the I never can say that word, the BSNF. Thank you. The Burlington Northern Santa Fe gave us a grant for $2,500 to buy rail that we put down in front of the depot. Even after we received that money, it took almost 2 years before we could actually find 70-pound or less rail to put out there, because anybody who had rail that lightweight, it was useless then, and so they just immediately scrapped it and sold it. So it took us a long time. Our rail out there, if you're interested, came from a factory that made flour and things like that over by Des Moines. And everybody had forgotten it was out there. It had grown up into a field, and it was just out there amongst the hay or the weeds or whatever was there. And so when they found it, we were just lucky to hear about it, and so that's how we even got the rail. So 60-pound rail, the minimum curves were 12.5 degrees. The maximum grade was 2.8% uncompensated, and I don't know what uncompensated means. But I do know that the reason that they used this was because it could make sharp turns where a standard gauge railroad would need much more room for a turn. And it could go up and down the hills and vales. And in the 36 miles of the narrow gauge, there were bridge after bridge and trestle after trestle because the ground was like this, and they would try to go sailing across the top. So, starting at Bellevue, it started at Bellevue, and at Bellevue they had a turntable and coal and water and freight and transfer facilities, and then the trains headed west, crossing Mill Creek, if you're familiar with the Bellevue area. After a couple of miles, they passed a siding. And it was necessary to have the siding because they'd have to park half the train and do what they called doubling, because the grade was so steep that they couldn't pull very many cars up that steep hill. So they'd have to leave half behind, they'd have to take half up, then go back and pick up the others. That's to get to the Lamont area where our little depot was, 11 miles from Bellevue. Once they got to Lamont, a water tank was very necessary. After fighting that big long grade, they needed water. The next little town where there was a depot was Owingo, and then was Washington Mills. Washington Mills was 22 miles from Bellevue, and again, coal and water had to be, had to be available. Photo next. There you see a line of gondola cars. These gondola cars had just finished delivering coal to the 3 stations where the train would stop, and it's 36 miles from Bellevue to Cascade. And it would pass there, it would go to Bernard, then 4 level miles, the easy miles, 4 level miles in this whole railroad, and it would finally go through Fillmore, and then it would end up on Cascade, which is on the North Fork of the Maquoketa River. So at Cascade, there was also a turntable, and coal and water as usual, but all 3 of the coaling stations had a special coaling apparatus, and it consisted of a bucket and an operated winch, a hand-operated winch. They would have to load the coal with a bucket and a hand-operated winch. Each bucket held a half a ton of coal. And a small engine just pulling 2 passenger cars from Bellevue to Cascade burned 1.5 to 2 tons of coal to get that far. Okay, all went well, 25 years went by, and roads by then still left a lot to be desired. The automobile was still considered a rich man's toy, and horses and railroads were still how people got around and how people did their work. So in 1905, business was good, but then it happened, what every railroad hopes against. There was a bad rep. So on February 22nd of 1907, a mixed train, meaning there were freight cars and passenger cars, it was train number 103 westbound. It derailed on the curved trestle. Whoops, next.
Okay.
Sorry. The curved trestle. So this is one of the this is the longest curved trestle going into Washington Mills. So you can see the train car as it fell down, it derailed. There were 2 cars, I think, that fell. The cars fell some 40 feet. And the coal car landed on top of the coach. It collapsed just like a pancake, killed 1 woman instantly. I'm trying to remember her name. Her niece comes into the museum a lot. The niece's name is Sally. So 1 woman died instantly and 2 died later of injuries. So there were 3 people that lost their lives because of the wreck, and 7 others were severely injured. So next picture. So that gives you an idea from the ground level what it looked like as it came off the trestle. So you can see, that was a pretty bad accident. It was the only fatal accident that this little railroad had in over 70 decades of operating. So really, they had a very good safety record for the time.
Is that in 1907?
1907, yes.
Next.
Oh, and could you go back to, maybe you can't go back.
Again.
Okay, back to,
I got it.
one more.
One more.
Yeah. So, see the little white building? That's a schoolhouse. And they used the schoolhouse as kind of a triage area. They took the wounded people there, and that's where they cared for them until they could get them to the hospital, is in the little country school right there. Okay, back to two more up. I'm sorry, forward.
Is that the one you want?
Okay, that's good. Yes, thank you. Okay, so one of the interesting stories, not a happy story, but one of the interesting stories that Danny found that I haven't seen anywhere else. He interviewed a man by the name of Dick Bogue, B-O-G-U-E. And he talked about another tragedy that occurred while the train was stopped at the depot in Zwingle. And he said, in the summer of 1934, a beer truck came down the hill in Zwingle and crashed into the train as it was stopped at the depot. The driver had kicked the truck out of gear to coast down the hill. You know, you still see those signs today, and I think we probably don't know what they mean, but what do they say? Don't
Freewheel?
Freewheel. They were freewheel. Okay, they kicked it out of gear and they coasted down the hill in this beer truck. And so they couldn't stop. They hit the train. Some of the cars were knocked off the track, and a bad fire broke out. This man was there. He said, we pulled the kid out of the truck. His clothes had been burned off. We laid him under a tree and covered him with a sheet, but he died on the way to the Dubuque hospital. The other fellow got crippled up, but he lived. And he said, we knew we were going to get hit when we saw him coming, but there was nothing we could do about it. So, you know, things happened. At least that one wasn't the fault of the railroad. So next. So this is a picture of our Lamont Depot after it had been restored for the centennial. And it's fun to me to see that these are the footings for the water tank. Now we know we have a water tank under construction at Helen Rockworth's house. And someday we're going to have a water tank out here. So I have this ongoing argument with Rich, and I always lose those arguments.
Yeah.
But an ongoing argument because he thinks that the water tank needs to be on the other side of the depot, but historically we know it was on this side of the depot. So you can watch and see, but he'll probably win. He always does. Okay. So this picture is on the back cover of Denny's book, as he talks about our narrow gauge railroad. And today I learned some new information about our caboose because Lawrence Sheehan is here, and he has memories of that caboose. You want to tell us, or do you want me to? He didn't know I was going to ask him to do this.
Welcome to stay incognito. I don't know, did you put these on the?
I didn't put it. We have copies of wonderful pictures that Lawrence brought in.
Where the caboose and 4 boxcars ended up were on 216th Street. I don't know if you know where Cottonville is at on Y61, but it's a mile south of Cottonville and 2 miles east. And none of them are there anymore, but my grandfather bought the 4 boxcars and the caboose from the Bellevue Cascade Road when it went out of business, and it was moved out there by an old international truck back then in 1936 or whatever, and the 4 boxcars were used for mostly for livestock, for hogs and cattle, and my dad used to feed fat cattle, and he would let them go in the boxcars until they got too big, and we fed hogs in there. One day I almost lost my life to a mama sow in this picture here, she was upset I picked a little piglet up. All I wanted to do was help out, and the little piglet squealed, and it was a close encounter of the worst kind. The caboose sat up by the barn. Probably none of you can see this, but the caboose sat up by the barn, and was supposed to be used for a shop. It had a drill press in there and several several Model A tools and Model T tools and that, but for the most part it was used as a playhouse by us kids. And it served its purpose as a submarine, as a ship, and a warship, and airplane, and we had steering wheels up in the cupola there, and all the neighborhood kids played there, and probably maybe a lot of memories I'd like to forget, but here we go. But it was a playhouse for us and for our family and for the neighborhood kids. And we had a lot of good times in there. And the boxcars were used primarily for livestock. And my dad tried desperately to give the boxcars away to anyone that wanted to restore them, but he couldn't find any interest in it. And so he eventually gave, the boxcars eventually rotted. There was nothing left of them really, and so they were sadly enough bulldozed. But my dad gave the caboose to was he a representative or senator from Iowa, Cliff Lamborn from Kokota, who used to run a paving business here. He gave the caboose to Cliff Lamborn with the understanding that Cliff would see to it that the caboose was restored. And as I understand it, he went to Jim Schrader of Bellevue, and who's a bridge builder down there. And the caboose went to him, and they restored the caboose. As I understand it, they really only used the iron out of it, and they had to redo all the lumber from scratch. But they used the old caboose as a model. And from what I understand, the caboose is down in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and now on a track and being pulled around the track by the Mount Pleasant Steam Show Authority, or whatever you call it. And talked to an old schoolmate of mine, and I used to go to country school with, and he went down and rode in the caboose and on the track, and he got quite a charge out of that. So any of you want to go down and ride a caboose, you got to stand in line down there, I guess. But I have some pictures here if anybody wants to come by and look at the pictures. Here's one of me painting I can't remember if I'm painting the boxcar or the fence alongside it, but I was doing some painting there back in the, let's see, that would have been about 1968 probably. But this picture's backwards if anybody gets a hold of it, and so you'd have to turn it around again on your tablet or whatever. But I let, I forgot your name.
Bonnie.
Bonnie. Let Bonnie take a picture of these with her phone, and she might have scanned them too, I'm not sure. And so she took pictures of them. Anybody can look at these pictures as far as I'm concerned. I didn't let her scan the back. I didn't know whose privacy I'd be screwing up, but it's pretty much public knowledge. My dad owned this caboose and boxcar. Francis Sheehan is the one that owned it, and they went to, like I said, I went to Cliff Lamborn, and the trail gets murky after that. So.
The trail does get murky. Thank you.
Thanks.
I appreciate that. See, if I'd have told him I was going to ask him, he might have left.
I would have left.
He would have, but he did a wonderful job. Thank you very much, Lawrence. So when he says the trail got murky, I told him I'm a sore loser. The trail got murky because after Jim Schrader passed away, his wife and son or 2 sons, can't remember, deeded that caboose to the Jackson County Historical Society. We had all the paperwork signed and sealed, and we were waiting for a hard freeze because they had bridge equipment, and when there was a hard freeze, they were going over on the bank as you drive from Bellevue to St. Donatus, and they would pick up the caboose and they would bring it to us. Well, we had to put it in the Pennycroft machine shed on the fairgrounds for a while because we didn't have this property quite yet, and we were going to build a roundhouse out here, and that caboose was going to be the centerpiece of our roundhouse as we talked about the history of railroads in Jackson County. And so that was all underway, waiting for the hard freeze, when his son, Dan, I believe, came home. He was very, very nice. But he came into my office and he said to me, I'm sorry, but my dad's caboose is not going to be in a machine shed. And he took the caboose to Mount Pleasant. And I am happy that it is getting seen and ridden on by a lot of people. That's really nice. But you know, they didn't have a narrow gauge, and now that we have the little depot out here, that little caboose went by twice, 4 times a day in the beginning, twice a day later on. It just hurts my heart. It just seems to me like that needs to be here. So, yeah, so I'm a sore loser, but I'm excited to know. I did not know the middle part of the story, and so I'm really grateful that we have this. We have that information, and it's good that the caboose is still with us, and it's good that there are people around who got to play in it. Just like the combine that we built, it has a gumball machine in the back. Well, it has a gumball machine because people like this who used to play around the combine, it was locked, but they would look in the window and they could see a gumball machine in there. So a lot of people who come through remember that gumball machine, and that's why there's one in here today.
What is the combine?
The combine is the train car that we built out here. It sits out here. It's called a combine, a combination car, number 8. We did it from the drawings that were made, and it was a combination passenger car for overflow passengers when they didn't want to put a whole passenger car on the train if they just had a few extra passengers. They could put them in there. They could also put freight in there, and we built the one that had the railroad post office because to us that was the most interesting. And so our volunteers built that. It is a wonderful thing. People who come to see this just can't believe that our volunteers built it. We purchased a narrow gauge gondola car from the Golden Colorado Railroad Museum, and we had it brought back here. Thanks to Geraldine Lambert, we brought it back here. The men took it all apart. They kept only the metal wheels and the couplers, and everything else you see out there was done by our volunteers. A magnificent job. It was wonderful. So I just have for you just a series of pictures, and if Nancy will just kind of go through them, just to kind of remind you. There's our depot as it's set, as we first brought it here.
You want me to keep going?
Yep, just keep going. They're just supposed to. If anybody has any comments, like Kevin, who helped so much with this, if you have things to offer, please. So this is, I don't know who that is. Does anybody recognize her? I don't know who that is. But you can see that the ground is all prepared. The guys made the cement pad. We moved the depot onto it, and we even moved each and every one of the capital bricks from the original platform. We moved them over. You like that wee word, right? We moved them over. We moved them over and we laid them. So there again is.
I'm coming.
You're fine. We're fine. They're just pictures. So that's when we were planting corn out behind. That the Iowa DNR will not let us plant out there anymore because it goes into the food chain. So now we have a prairie. But you can see as the guys got ready to seed the yard and that sort of thing. And take a good look at our little gravel road here because it's becoming overgrown with weeds. And you might not see it, but it's there. And the one reason that it's there and that this is so important is that when we moved the depot from Lamont, it was on the National Register of Historic Places. And when we moved it, they stripped it of its title because it was no longer in the original place. But they know there's 3 criteria. 1 is its history, and 2 is its architecture. So as soon as we can prove to the State Historical Society and the National Park Service that it is separated from this building that's also on the National Register, we can apply to have it put back on. So that's why we have what we have, a little parking lot off to the side. We planted lilacs and things that would have been native plants back then, trying to make it appear that it's not connected with this building at all. And then we have a very good chance of putting it back on the National Register.
Ready?
Great. So these are just some pictures of the inside, and they are right after it was finished. Kevin was a big part of this, all of our railroad guys, and this is just after it was finished, before we really put different artifacts and things in there. So it'll look a little bare right now. But for those of you who haven't been in there, that is the original. That's what was there, and it's beautiful.
Did they have to rebuild the walls and stuff, or just refinish it all?
No, they were there, and we really didn't have to do much to refinish it, because all of the woodwork that you see was orange shellac. They still sell orange shellac today, and if you go over orange shellac with denatured alcohol and you rub it down, it kind of dissolves and respreads itself. And so we were able to go over everything and make it look pretty much like new. It's the original floor. Richard Rockwell refinished that entire floor for us. So everything you see in there, with the exception of the stove, is original. And we know that that bench is original. I believe it belongs to David Kendall. It's on loan from David Kendall. I feel safe because he doesn't have a place to put it, so I think he's going to let us keep it for a while.
He won't get it back.
He's not going to get it back. And the reason that the stove is not original is because Rick Clausen, as he owned this, after he restored it all, he sold antiques from it. And so he sold pot-bellied stoves and that sort of thing. So we don't know about this one. The one that was in there when we got the depot was very huge, very ornate, a lot of chrome. It's very fancy, way too big for the size of the building. So we took that out and we put in this one. And when we put this one in, our guys, our railroad guys, when they replaced the stovepipes and things, they lined the chimney, they did everything so that we can build a fire in there if we want, in that stove, and it'll be perfectly safe. And since we're going to have a haunted house in the fall, we may be using that if it's a cold night.
If you haven't been there, you've got to go out there. Makes the
It's
greatest she shed. I mean, it's just beautiful.
A she shed. Only
You
Nancy.
can see all kinds of things in there.
Okay, yeah. You can see right here the fire extinguisher. That's kind of interesting, but some of you may remember that's the way fire extinguishers were back in the day. It has a chemical inside, and when you, well, this one had a paraffin stopper in the top. If there was a fire, that would melt. It would cause a chemical reaction. Everything would come out, and it would suck all the oxygen out of the air, which would put the fire out because you had to have oxygen for a fire. So that was really, that's a nice artifact that came with the depot. And again, our stove that we put in.
The ticket.
Oh, thank you. And the ticket, you'll see the little ticket counter there. You're looking at you're looking at from the passenger side. On the other side, the agents, that's where the agent would go to sell you your ticket when you went to buy a ticket for a ride on the narrow gauge. And we do have some tickets.
And there's the back side.
Yeah, there's the back side. And this would be the agent's room, the middle room of the depot, where the railroad agent stayed. And you can see that there are windows on the sides, and so he could sit at his desk and look up and down the track and see when the train was coming. There is, well, it's not there yet. Well, it is on that.
Do I go back?
Would you?
Yep.
Okay, so you see that funny little thing on the desk? That is the telegraph key and the telegraph thing. That was really important, and our railroad guys made that workable. So now, when the battery's not dead, you could use the telegraph key. Of course, everything was by telegraph, and then it will answer from the back. And I think this is the last photo. But to me, it's a representation of what our wonderful volunteers did. But you see this chimney, all of the individual bricks? It's sitting on a wooden cabinet, which is pretty remarkable because that's a lot of weight on a wooden cabinet with it has no beams inside, it's just a wooden cabinet. But that's 2 bricks thick, and there's another 4 foot up on the roof. So that all had to come down before we could move the depot from Lamont. Ron Yeager, and with help from Lana Flegel some days, Ron Yeager sat out in our yard for weeks, Lana? Weeks. He sat out here and he cleaned the old mortar from each and every brick so that we could put the original bricks back up with 4 foot on the roof. So that is a devoted volunteer. And I'll always remember Ron Yeager. It was one of many things that he did for us. But Kevin, do you have anything to add?
No, you're doing an excellent job.
That's a cop-out. Does anybody have anything to add about
You
our...
mentioned Dale Heaster was the man that we got to
Thank
put
you.
the brick on the chimney back together again.
Yes,
And did a great job.
he did.
And yeah, Ron cleaned out here. He come third time every day and clean for a couple hours and go home the next day to be back.
Yeah, it took hours for him to clean all those books. And it was not easy on the hands.
And also, of course, by the time we got it, it had a shingle roof on it, but it originally would have had wood shingles, and that's what we did put back on again, was wood shingles.
Kevin was the master of the cedar shingles. Do you remember anything about that? This is a very steep roof, if you've noticed the pictures that we've shown you.
Yeah.
And Kevin was all over that roof, putting those shingles on
Yeah,
it.
we put up scaffolding, of course, so you could safely work up there. You can stand on it, but it's steep enough that you have to pay attention. You don't go sliding or something. So you want a safe place to land, like on the scaffolding, rather than the ground. So, but in the end, it all turned out very nice. We think it's probably about like it should be originally. And of course, you realize this is the second depot that was placed there. The first one burned down, and then it was replaced with this one. That was in the 1870s sometime.
So the original depot was 1879, it burned in 1910,
Okay.
and 1910 to 1911, this depot was built on the exact same spot.
The first one had vertical board and battens on it. It looked
That's right.
somewhat like the barns and stuff at the time. And then this one was kind of an upgrade. And David Kendall could tell you more about the details of the depot that was being built by the railroad at that time. But this was kind of a standard issue depot for that time period.
Thanks, Kevin. And I know that on our YouTube channel, David Kendall gave a wonderful program about the narrow gauge. I mean, he grew up on the narrow gauge. It went through their farm, the Potter Farms, and he gave a program for our annual meeting, I think. But I saw the other day that that is on our YouTube channel if you want to hear David talk about the narrow gauge, and he knows a great deal about it. He really does. So one of the reasons that we had such a hard time moving it is because the roof is so steep and so tall, we were required to take the roof off. So our trusty volunteers cut this roof in half, right in the middle, and we had to hire a crane. The name of the crane was Splinters, which was very nerve-wracking. But they came, they lifted off the 2 halves of the depot. One went on your truck, Kevin, did it? Your trailer?
Yeah, I got a neighbor in his truck to help, we put on 2 flatbed trailers. So it ended up being about 22 feet on each section, something like that. And I remember when we came across the bridge over here in the Coker River, there was like one foot to spare on each side.
Just barely
It was
made it
almost a
across.
squeaker over there. So, but
It was. It took almost all day to move this, the 20 miles from Lamont to here. The main part of the building came on a truck. We hired a house mover to move that. We hired sprinters, and everything else was done by our volunteers, which was really, really wonderful. When we got over here, and the 2 trucks were, Kevin's truck and the other truck were parked out here, each had half of the roof. It was just getting dark. It may have been Lana that was with me, was it? So we were out here, and we were just finally so tired, getting ready to go home, and we heard beep, 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 and we went back, and there was a bird's nest in the fancy parts that where you can see up where the yellow parts are. There was a bird's nest with all these little birds.
And you moved it?
And the mother bird was back in Lamont, for sure. So I got Nancy Lang, she came down, we put a ladder in the back of her truck, we took the bird nest out, and the next day she took it to some place in animals so that it rehabs animals, so all the little birds lived. Just one of the funny stories. All right, does anybody else have anything to add? I hope you'll watch for the book to come out. It is a compilation. He didn't have time to write a whole, it's not the in-depth history that's in the first book, but valuable information. And now is the Jackson County Historical Society not only the home of Iowa Orphan Train research, where we also have all of the research that he did writing the book about the narrow gauge. And so those are valuable things for any historical society to have. So thank you very much for coming. The book will be printed as soon as possible. So I hope everybody will spread the word and we'll sell a lot of books. Okay, thank you very much.